Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Fry. I'm a healthcare attorney at McGuire Woods in Chicago, and it's my privilege and honor to be here today with my colleague in McGuire Woods Consulting, Stephanie Kennan, Senior Vice President, who has been part of virtually every major piece of Medicare and Medicaid legislation passed in the last 25 years as a staffer, lobbyist, or working on both sides, although she's been a part of it, been lobbying on it, maybe even a staffer on it. I don't think Stephanie will necessarily take credit for every piece of those legislation, especially not blame, but I'll leave that to her. She was a senior health policy advisor to Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, for 10 years, for more than 10 years. Also worked in federal relations for Maryland's Department of Health, the American College of Emergency Physicians, and a legislative representative for AARP, and now part of McGuire Woods Consulting, where not only lobbies but also works in a lot of regulatory matters before CMS and the Department of Health and Human Services. Again, my name's Tim Fry. This is a return to something I did before becoming an attorney a little bit more, and so it's fun. I worked as a federal lobbyist for the National Rural Health Association and then went to work for CMS for a couple of years before law school. And so getting a chance to kind of talk with Stephanie here this afternoon is a privilege. Getting to talk about whether it was a blue wave or a red save in some ways, and then talk about what that means for healthcare policy over the next 2 to 4 to 6 years. It should be interesting. I do invite you to use the web app to ask questions, and I will try to infuse those in. So, Stephanie, to kind of kick us off, let's go back to last Tuesday night. Depending on kind of where you look, counting of votes is still happening in California. Recounts have started in Florida, but it looks like House Democrats picked up somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 seats. Republicans picked up maybe 2-3 state seats in the Senate, although that's still subject to change in both cases. Any surprises from Tuesday night when you kind of look at it and the election results? What you expected? Was it to script or something else?
Well, thank you, Tim. I think that it was a blue wave in some places, a blue dribble in others, and then some states were completely dry. So it shows how we were divided in our politics and across the country. And I think that for some states, there will definitely be a change. When we did these slides yesterday, we had picked up 32 seats. We've now picked up 33 seats. There's still 4 that are in the lead. There are some, for example, Carolyn Bordeaux is a Democrat in the 7th District of Georgia. She is 901 votes behind the last time I checked. So we may be picking up more, and we may have some surprises like those. I think that the seat that Newt Gingrich had held for so long and had been Republican for so long was definitely a surprise for folks. I think the governorships, flipping 7 governorships was crucial, but also I think a bit of a surprise to some people because it showed the depth of the electorate wanting change.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
No, go ahead.
Well, and we'll be talking throughout a little bit more about some of the election results and maybe some other things that the country was thinking about. But before kind of continuing down that path, it may make sense to just spend a minute on the 115th Congress in the last 2 years, where we saw at least a couple different Affordable Care Act, Obamacare repeal efforts. Most dramatically ended by the late Senator McCain giving a thumbs down on the floor. But that seems to be what Congress did on health care for the last 2 years. True or false? Anything else accomplished the last 2 years in health care?
Well, there was a lot of repeal and replace, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of what was embedded in repeal and replace in a moment. But they were able to extend CHIP for 10 years. They did that in two steps. The first step was 6 years, and then they later on were able to tack on 4 years. And that is a legacy piece for Senator Hatch, who's the retiring chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and one of the fathers of CHIP. They held multiple hearings on drug prices. Some of those hearings were sparked by the concerns over the cost of certain drugs and the role of pharmaceutical benefit managers. But they didn't really pass a lot of legislation there. However, at the very end, they were able to pass some legislation that would eliminate gag clauses in contracts that prevent pharmacists from telling patients that for some drugs paying out of pocket would be less expensive than using their own insurance. And that was hailed as a great breakthrough. And the reason for that is that there's just not a good consensus about how to approach drug prices. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of evolved thinking, but they haven't really come together to have a consensus package that will address drug prices in Congress. I think most members would think that the capstone was passing the opioid legislation that was bipartisan, bicameral. In fact, if you looked at the House legislation and the Senate legislation, many of the provisions were the same. A few details were different. There were some things that the Senate wanted to do that did not make it into the package, one being having companies that promote drugs through direct-to-consumer advertising have to include their list price. Senator Grassley and Senator Durbin were behind that. It didn't make it into the final package, but the administration ran with that idea and is looking at how to actually implement that now. But I think the opioid legislation probably was the most sweeping of what they were able to pass. To just turn back to repeal and replace of the ACA, they spent a lot of time doing that. Embedded in the replacing parts were some ideas related to Medicare and Medicaid, which helped them pass that legislation in the House and is what, in some respects, killed it in the Senate. The Senate just wasn't ready for some of the premium support ideas in the Medicare portion, and they wanted to block grant Medicaid, and even a few Republicans had some problems with that in the Senate. But that left the failure to act has left a vacuum for those who want to change the ACA, and that has led to a number of actions by the Trump administration, particularly related to association health plans and short-term plans.
Yeah, and Stephanie, it seems like, and we'll talk in a second about the next Congress with that, but it seems like a lot maybe then was discussed. You mentioned the hearings. Do you foresee anything here in the next month and a half as part of the lame duck session?
That's a really good question. Normally, at the end of a Congress, there are a bunch of, for lack of a better term of art, cats and dogs that people want to pass. Pharma had wanted to address some issues related to their liability for closing the Part D Medicare donut hole. They had hoped to tack that on to the opioid legislation, and it got kicked off. They have continued, while Congress has been in recess, to try to lobby for that to be done in the at the end here, at the lame duck. Some members, one leader, Leader McConnell, actually said he thought they could do it during lame duck. It's now appearing that it will be harder because not that many, there's no big health package being put together at this point. It would have to ride on something probably unrelated, and there doesn't seem to be a momentum among the members to want to do that now. However, having said that, there are always small healthcare bills, usually bills that members who are not returning want to get done as their last bit of legacy pieces. So I would expect to see something start to move on healthcare, and it could be as easy as if it's a controversial measure and doesn't cost much or has a pay-for built in, meaning it's a policy change that costs money, but they have a way of paying for it. You could see something move on the suspension calendar in the House and by unanimous consent in the Senate. Again, very small bills. Or if there are some things that they need to do before they leave, and they could try to attach some health care to some of those moving pieces. One of the things they need to do before they leave is to fund the rest of the government that is only funded through December 7th. There is some thought now that maybe they'll just do a clean continuing resolution and kick the can into February. There are others who want to just take care of it and not have to deal with it right away in February. Members are just getting back into town, and we probably won't know the strategy or the thinking of how to move the cats and dogs and how to move the CR until probably closer to Thanksgiving or right after Thanksgiving, when they've all had a chance to talk to each other and figure some things out.
Great, great. Stephanie, something that a lot of our clients have been interested in that Congress did discuss, and the administration has been discussing as well, is kind of reforms to the physician self-referral law, also known as, the Stark law, commonly known that way. Do you see that continuing in the next Congress? Do you see the administration taking a pen to some of the regulations around that complex legislation?
Actually, I think the administration may beat Congress to doing some of the low-hanging fruit. In this Congress, both the House Ways and Means Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee have had roundtables and hearings looking at what they could do related to the Stark laws, because they've become so complicated and subject to so many interpretations. But they never really had a plan of, we'll do X, Y, and Z. They were still working on it. Some of the members who were involved in that and leading some of that, like Congressman Roscom, won't be back. But I think that there is enough concern about how complicated those laws have become, and the fact that they are hampering some of the alternative payments and delivery systems, that Congress will continue to want to work on that next year or the year, and it may be a 2-year function, but because of the complicated nature. But that is something a number of members want to continue to work on. The administration, when they first came in the door, I am aware that there was a list that career staff at HHS had put together of issues they would like to address and could address through regulation having to do with the self-referral laws. And so they are working on it. They put out a notice for information asking people for their ideas, and it is entirely possible that the administration could put out something through the regulatory process sooner rather than later, because it is something they're trying to really work on and get out the door, because they see a real need to unblock some of the things so they can do new payment models and delivery systems. The one other thing I would add is that they're in the Senate, while they haven't been that active on the self-referral issue, when Deputy Secretary Hargan was before the Finance Committee, he got a lot of questions about physician-owned hospitals, and it's very clear that several senators, say one from Texas in particular, may be looking for legislative action on self-referral in order to bring back the physician-owned hospital issue.
Sounds like the next Congress is a lot to do, so we'll get to that in just a second. But before we do that, in the lead up to the election, Stephanie wrote a kind of a series of articles about the 115th Congress. That should be available on the McGuire Woods Consulting website, and I'll also offer up, you'll see my email address at the end of this webinar. Feel free to email me, and I'll make sure the link gets sent to you so you don't even have to poke around. So switching gears, to kind of the 116th Congress, Stephanie, we kind of framed that the House had flipped. The Democrats picked up a lot of seats, which, is not news to anybody on this call. but that obviously means we've got at least divided Congress. They already had enough trouble passing, sweeping legislation, as you talked about. What kind of do you see the role of the House versus the Senate with this kind of divided bicameral situation, and how does that play out over the next 2 years?
Sure, and I'll talk about the leadership changes as well as we talk through this. The House will play, because they will be democratically controlled, they will play the role of being a roadblock on some of the key Republican initiatives. Repealing the ACA obviously is not going to happen. Sweeping changes in Medicare reform and in Medicaid won't happen either, in large part because you'll never be able to get the Senate and the House Ways and Means committees to actually sit down and figure out an approach to do major reform. What I think we will see is people like Congressman Neal, who's going to be the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who has been around for a very long time, helped craft the ACA, was in Congress before the ACA, and worked on a number of Medicare reimbursement issues. He will be reaching out, trying to find Republicans to work with, probably to stabilize the individual market. He is not someone who's going to be looking to do change so that he can say, I've done change, and then it dies on the floor of the House. He is going to be working to do things that can actually pass. Congressman Pallone will be chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He's from a state that has a huge pharmaceutical representation. He's already said he wants to work on lowering drug prices, and he wants to work on more options in Medicaid for treatment of opioid addiction and other addictions. So I think with those two changes, you'll see trying to develop some consensus, but it won't be sweeping changes. They'll be working on very specific, perhaps incremental pieces. Over in the Senate, I think they're still trying to figure out how they're going to work with a democratically controlled House. And let me just say, I've worked in the House and I've worked in the Senate, and they're very different. The Senate, you are one person, you can throw a monkey wrench into whatever is passing. And not just being the last vote to vote no, as McCain did, but when I worked for Senator Wyden, there was an effort to undo something in Oregon through federal law, and we were prepared to filibuster, and in fact did start several filibusters when legislation was introduced in a tax bill to kill something in Oregon. And it was a very long, slow process to get there. We had committees that couldn't hold hearings because we used the rules. You may see in the Senate some partisanship in terms of using the rules to slow things down. But there will at some point have to be some consensus between the House and the Senate on some items. And I think that the new members, in particular in the House, feel they are coming here to find that consensus. So it'll be an interesting evolution to watch to see if they are able to help find the consensus so that Congress can function again. But I think the most important takeaway is that the House will be a roadblock to a lot of Republican initiatives in health care. They're just not compatible with the majority. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so, Stephanie. I think then you also throw in the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue with the president and the administration, and I don't think it would be unfair to say the Democratic minority didn't always get along with the president, and so it seems like a bit of a volatile situation there.
Well, yes, and I think that you will see Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means doing oversight hearings. They may not be doing oversight hearings particularly on healthcare policy, but oversight hearings. Ways and Means, for example, is the committee that will be charged with trying to get Donald Trump's tax records because the IRS falls under the Ways and Means Committee. Pallone will probably be focusing on Medicaid and how the expansions have gone and how issues like having a work requirement, what is that doing to people who are trying to get Medicaid. So I think that will be some areas of contention. There's another committee that we haven't mentioned, and that's the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, which will be headed up by Elijah Cummings. Congressman Cummings has used his ranking Democrat position in this Congress to raise a number of issues related to drug pricing, and some of it not solely focused on, what is the price of the pharmaceutical. It is what is CMS doing so that it is a better steward of Medicare dollars when it comes to drugs. There was an issue related to how a particular drug was categorized, and that affected how it was reimbursed. And I think he will coordinate with the other committees, but I think he may continue that focus of, okay, what is the government doing in its everyday process that it impacts what we're paying for drugs? He may find other areas that he wants to get involved with as well, but I would expect some action from him. But let me just mention the Senate in their leadership in healthcare. Senate Finance Committee is currently headed up by Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah. He was retiring, and Senator Grassley is the next member in seniority. He's currently the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He was chairman of the Finance Committee for 4 years, I want to say between 2002 and 2006. He had made it known before the election that if the Republicans stayed in the majority, he would like to take the gavel back at Finance. He could only do it for 2 years because the Republicans have rules that limit how long you could be a chairman at a committee, but he would like to do it for 2 years. And he had said if they went into the minority, he would like to hand it over to Senator Crapo of Idaho. It appears that Grassley's going to get it. That also helps Senator Crapo kind of have 2 years to get ready to be chairman, assuming they remain control in 2020. It is always helpful when a member who is moving up has time to get used to the idea of being chairman and what is entailed with being a chairman. Because to be perfectly honest with you, it's different watching it than doing it. And my former boss was briefly chairman of the Finance Committee and had very little time to prepare for his ascension to the chairmanship. And although he's been a chairman of another committee, finance is special. So it's always helpful to have a little learning time. But Senator Grassley, in his past chairmanship of the Finance Committee, yes, he likes to legislate, but he also likes to do oversight. And I understand from some folks in the not-for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector that they're all a little concerned about him being there because that's just the area he likes to do oversight on. I will give you an example. It's an issue that he has done off and on. When I was on the Hill, he was doing it full bore, and that is looking at the community benefit that not-for-profit hospitals are required to give since they have a different tax status. And he has brought that issue up on a regular basis, and he's been able to change some behavior without doing any legislation, which I think he likes the best. But he's been able, it's been a big issue for him. It will probably continue to be a big issue. But he will do a lot of oversight, and it may lead to legislation, but it may just scare people into the way he thinks you should behave. And Finance has committee over Medicare, has jurisdiction over Medicare and Medicaid. Health Committee has jurisdiction over the FDA, and that will remain with Senator Alexander. And the ranking member there is Patty Murray from Washington. They have a very good working relationship, even when they disagree. But I would expect that committee will continue to do, try to find areas where they can work in a bipartisan way and still get their policy initiatives done. In fact, the opioid legislation in the Senate, actually, the Health Committee was one of the first committees to figure out a way to do bipartisan work together on that issue. So that is a committee that's worth watching as well.
Great. Hey, just to kind of close out a couple things, one came through from a question from the audience. You had kind of mentioned Pallone and his oversight work on Medicaid, but Medicaid expansion question here, and I think there were 3 or 4 ballot initiatives, especially out west in conservative states. The governors of Maine and Kansas flipped after legislatures in both states had passed Medicaid expansion that had gotten vetoed. So it seems like there's kind of an expansion now on Medicaid expansion in some more conservative states, kind of almost mirroring what happened in the late or in the 70s and early 80s in terms of Medicaid, the program itself. Do you kind of foresee that trend continuing with more ballot initiatives, states saying, hey, this is a cheap way to get a lot of our people covered, or do you think it was just a function of this particular election?
I think it's a result of this particular election, and you're absolutely right. In Maine and Kansas, you had state legislatures that wanted to do something, and the governors were blocking it. And I think Maine was a particularly interesting case because it was so clear the people wanted to do it, and the governor just didn't want to implement it. The only state where the initiative fell was in Montana, and I believe that's because of some concern about how to pay for it. And I understand that there are folks in Montana who right now are working on trying to figure out a different way to pay for it and see if they can get expansion moving there as well. But there's a larger implication here, which is that Medicaid expansion in more states starts to fulfill part of what the ACA wanted to do, cover more people. But it also means that those states are going to face the same problem those states who have already expanded. If the federal government, as they're supposed to, ratchets down the payment, then what did they do? So I think there'll be more discussions about Medicaid financing because of that. But it also means that Medicaid becomes even larger purchaser of health care services and products, which was going to be the ultimate end of the ACA once it was completely implemented. So I think it's a good thing for many of these states, and I think that it's a result solely because of this. The other issue to watch related to these expansions, the current administration wants to put work requirements into more of these expansions. It'll be interesting to see how the states finagle that, whether they do that or don't do that. And work requirements are incredibly controversial within DC because of concerns about what has happened in some states where people lost their Medicaid coverage, and there'll probably be some oversight hearings on that. So I think it's an evolving issue, and I think that it's going to be one that everybody will want to watch.
And Stephanie, maybe one last general question here on the election, and maybe the question is, was this something you expected after the last couple election cycles, or was it a surprise? And that has to do with, exit polls suggest 40% of voters on election day rated healthcare as its most important issue. They seem to overwhelmingly back Democrats after a number of cycles of healthcare being an issue that Republicans were energized on. The last couple of weeks of the campaign, the president was tweeting about how Democrats were going to take away the Obamacare pre-existing condition protection, which, as an outsider now outside D.C., felt awfully weird after listening to how the Affordable Care Act was, communism and all the rest for the last 10 years. Was it a surprise? Is it been the evolution that you've been seeing in D.C.? It seems like the healthcare position may have shifted in this election.
I think the perception of the ACA changed in this election for some. The pre-existing condition protections had always been the most popular part of the ACA. one of the things I thought was interesting is that before Congress recessed, members were dropping in resolutions right and left about how they cared about pre-existing conditions. And in fact, there were a group of members who dropped in legislation to keep the pre-existing condition protections. Only after you analyzed it, you realized what that bill actually said was if you have a pre-existing condition, the insurer has to take you, but they didn't have to cover the expenses from that pre-existing condition for a certain time period. But yet they could say they went out and they were for pre-existing condition coverage. As somebody who has watched this for a long time, it sort of boggled my mind that suddenly Republicans were saying they were for pre-existing condition coverage, because coverage and insurance is not something you can just pull out a thread and then have everything still standing. And the way the ACA is put together, it's particularly difficult because it is so interwoven. I think people started to see the polls and started to see people's nervousness about being, one diagnosis away from having a pre-existing condition. I think that a lot of people didn't fully comprehend what that meant to the average citizen, that they got lost in the philosophy of the ACA. But I also know from past experience, I was I'm so old that I remember the catastrophic coverage when Reagan was in, and I was at AARP at the time, and one of the lead lobbyists working on catastrophic coverage, and the rebellion that happened after that passed because people didn't understand how it would impact them. They only saw what their premiums would be. And I think healthcare is complicated, and I think it takes a long time for people to start to understand both the pros and the cons. And one of the reasons the Obama administration wanted to get it done early was so that it would have time to become part of the basic American healthcare culture. And that is in part why they ended up ramming it through without any Republican support. If they'd had Republican support, we would have had probably very different conversations, but it would have been much later in their administration. So I think, any huge sweeping reform can be characterized or cast as a big negative, and it takes a while for people to absorb it. And I think we're starting to get the kinks out, not all of them, but some of the kinks out, and then a new administration came in with a completely different philosophical point of view. But the voters came back and said, no, there's some things we really care about. And I think that is one of the interesting things. Also, just to add one other thing in many races, the issue was, do you support Medicare for all? And Medicare for all means different things to different people, I have learned. So, that discussion kind of, I think, enhanced the reasonableness of the ACA for some people. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of moving the Overton window a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a lawyer, properly trained in law school. I can't get off a call like this without talking about the third branch of government, the judiciary. But there is some interesting things happening in the judiciary before we turn back to kind of priorities in the next Congress, which we've already started talking about, but we'll continue. And here, unlike maybe the Democrats in the House protecting the ACA, there seems to be another individual mandate case coming through since Congress kind of zeroed out the mandate tax, and so there's another challenge here in the courts. Thoughts? I know you're tracking this case. What are some of the prognosticators saying here?
Well, it's interesting to follow this case, and then there was a second case filed in September by Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosch, and it was after the arguments were made in the Texas case. And the Texas case has 20 Republican state attorney generals and governors filing for this, and in the oral arguments, there were a couple of things that happened, and then I'll briefly talk about the Maryland case. This case basically says the individual mandate isn't valid because the penalty has been zeroed out, and that if you find the individual mandate is not valid, then a number of other things fall as well, including the guaranteed issue and community rating provisions and the pre-existing condition exclusion clauses. The federal government came in and seemed to have a little cold feet about saying if the individual mandate is no longer constitutional, then everything else is not constitutional. And they seem to argue slightly differently that the individual mandate wasn't constitutional, but that didn't mean you couldn't sever it from the rest of it. And I'm not using legal terms, I know, Tim, but you could divide and conquer, essentially.
Yes.
And the arguments were September 5th. The judge said he would be ruling soon. The administration asked him not to rule until December so that they wouldn't cause chaos in the insurance markets because we're in open enrollment. So the upshot of that case is that clearly it will go to the Supreme Court. How fast, we don't know. But when it is finalized and an opinion comes out of the Supreme Court, that may force both the Senate and the House to do something related to stabilizing the markets, because you could have some real serious chaos and misunderstanding in the public and chaos among the insurance companies trying to be in compliance of whatever they will need to figure out from an opinion. The second case, the Maryland case that I mentioned, after the oral arguments, Maryland went to court. The oral arguments in Texas were September 5th. Maryland went to court on September 13th to ask the court to find that the ACA's individual mandate was constitutional, or at least that it was severable from the rest of the ACA. And I think Brian Frosch, the Attorney General of Maryland, has been a bit of a thorn in the Trump administration's side on a number of issues. I think what Frosch was trying to do there is try to hurry it up to the Supreme Court, because if he got a ruling quickly there, he could then move on. But neither one has been ruled on yet.
Got it. And one of the questions that came in from the audience, and this kind of takes it back to Congress a little bit, but it seems like these cases on the individual mandate are the most likely vehicles. If you're against the Affordable Care Act and want to see it go away, it seems like repeal is likely going to be a judicial thing, if it is at all, and not a congressional act in the next 2 years. Do you agree with that, Stephanie?
I think that's an excellent observation, that if it'll be the courts that undo the ACA if that's the way they rule, but Congress will not be able to move on repeal at all. If the court decides against the ACA, essentially, and says the individual mandate and everything is unconstitutional, I think Congress will have to act, and act fairly swiftly, to keep the health insurance markets calm. But I have no idea how they'll get together and do that.
Stay tuned, I guess. We'll do another one of those calls in a few, if that takes place. Yeah. Hey, there's also a court case pending on association health plans challenging some regulatory actions the Trump administration took. Do you want to say a few words about the association health plans and what that court case looks like?
Sure. With it was 12 Democratic attorney generals. They argued that the ACA provided clear rules for differentiating between the size of employers and individuals for purposes of market regulation, and that the rule that the administration put out on association health plans essentially fudges that, and in fact doesn't even use the definitions and rules that the Department of Labor has done for a long time in what constitutes an employer. Last September, 2 federal district courts ruled that the ACA's non-discrimination provision, oops, that's another issue, sorry. The judge in the Association of Health Plans said he would rule shortly. He has not yet ruled. I've talked to people who were at the oral arguments and said basically he didn't seem terribly impressed by either side, and had made the comment, "We're going to the Supreme Court anyway." So that's another one to stay tuned on.
Got it. So it sounds like the Roberts Court is going to have some interesting new decisions coming down the pike in the next few years. Another one that could be like that is, potentially, Stephanie, the transgender protections and whether Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act applies to them. I know the Obama administration had thought they did. Texas court threw it out, but now district courts are kind of looking back at the legislative language and saying that without ruling whether the administration got it right, that the plain language of the statute suggests that transgender individuals are protected. Do you want to say a few words about that as well?
Sure. There have actually been 2 federal district courts rulings. They both ruled similarly that the ACA's non-discrimination provision prohibits discrimination against transgender individuals for coverage of health services. One of the cases was in Minnesota, and he concluded that an earlier nationwide injunction blocking the protections offered under the Obama administration's regulation was irrelevant. And in Wisconsin, the judge based his decision on the statute, as he said. So those cases will probably end up heading towards the Supreme Court at some point as well, but that may be a longer road than the other 2 that we just talked about.
Got it. So why don't we switch back to your neck of the woods there in D.C. And get your thoughts and experience kind of priorities for the new Congress. And I know the slides that everyone has a few things. But before we hit a few of those, one of the questions from the audience that came in asked if the new Congress might do anything about balance billing, the surprise bills in emergency departments and narrow networks. I know that's been a big issue in some states. Legislation's been passed. Do you see anything happening there on kind of a federal level?
That's a very good question. It's an issue that keeps percolating up from the states, and Congress keeps hoping the states will deal with it under state law. I know that there are several members, one in particular from Colorado, who really care deeply about surprise bills, and that there's been a lot of discussion about trying to move legislation. I would say that that's probably one of those issues that if they feel they have to do something, the states aren't taking what they feel is their proper role, the Congress would probably at least hold oversight hearings and start to work out some of the kinks in some of the existing legislation and see if they can move it. There are a number of, let me just say that I think that as we started off by saying that a number of the new members came in because saying that healthcare was their number one priority. Healthcare means a lot of different issues to different people. It could mean the ACA. It could mean changing Medicare reimbursement. It could mean making sure that community hospital doesn't close. It could mean drug prices. It could mean issues like this. And I think that the new members in particular are looking for issues where they can do something and it is meaningful to people's lives without a lot of explanation. And surprise bills are certainly something they could work on. I'm not going to give you a crystal ball about whether it will pass or not, but I think they will at least discuss it and have a few hearings.
It's the type of thing that, doesn't necessarily show up as a big cost to the federal government when you can mandate that down to providers, which can also make it easier for them to bite, I would think. Talking about costs, one of the issues I know when we were talking before today, the Affordable Care Act extended the, at least on paper, solvency of the Medicare and Medicaid programs for a decade, but we're starting to get back where you're on the clock to, just a few years of solvency left on those programs. Are we now at a point where the conversations in Washington are such that we're back to, hey, we've got to save these programs, or they're going to go bankrupt, or is that just kind of something looming in the background that may be addressed, but it's not really going to be at the forefront of the conversation?
That's a really good question, and I need to answer it in two ways. There will always be discussion about Medicare solvency, Social Security solvency, but you need to look at Congress like kids at college. They don't really address the crisis until it's, until the final exam is right in front of them. The Social Security reforms that were done in the 80s were not done with a lot of lead time. It was truly, there was going to be a crisis. There was not going to be money to send out checks. They had to do something, and they put together a group, and they did something. I think Medicare reform is one of those issues where there will be continued talk and discussion and lots of ideas thrown out there, but that real action won't happen on a sweeping reform until there's really a crisis right in front of us. So what they will do instead is try to do things that shove it out a little bit. The other issue that is looming is the federal deficit, of which Medicare is a good portion, as is Medicaid. And regardless of who is going to be in charge of Congress or particular parts of Congress, they're going to have to address the deficit in some way. They usually try to address that through the budget process. The budget process has been broken. There are members who are working on budget reform right now, which is an arcane technical process that we don't need to discuss here. But it could be, as budget reconciliation has been in the past, an avenue to make changes, policy changes, some of which we may want, some of which we may not want, if they save money, to both help the deficit and extend some of the Medicare solvency issues. Medicaid, because the Republicans have wanted to block grant that program, or the new phrase is universal budget, for so long, and Democrats have been uncomfortable with that concept. I don't see that kind of reform happening this year, solely because I just don't see any way to bring the two sides together on a consensus of how to change Medicaid. I think that the administration will probably play a larger role in what kind of requirements they put on Section 1115 waivers as states try to do their expansions. Work requirements is a perfect example of that. So I don't think that there'll be sweeping reforms, but there'll be incremental steps.
And Stephanie, just for the folks on the call, but block granting or the universal budgeting, that's basically, instead of a matching fund to the states, just a fixed amount, maybe per enrollee or some other number that every state has to allot, kind of like what they did with the what was formerly known as welfare. Is that right? Yeah,
there'd be basically you'd be handed the money and so told, here's your money, state X, and it's so much per enrollee, and you figure it out. But that doesn't mean there'd be increases necessarily for a downturn in the economy and more people on Medicaid. It means that there wouldn't necessarily be increases that match the cost of increases in health care. And that's always been the nervous part. Plus, the Republican Party has always sold it as a flexibility issue. And to be very honest with you, some Democrats don't think some states know what they're doing, so they wouldn't be comfortable with giving certain states just money and say, figure it out. They want some control over how it is actually spent. A difference in philosophy of the parties.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, you talked a little bit about hearings in terms of drug pricing. That's been something the president has, made proposals about. It seems like an area where there may be some overlap. You mentioned kind of the ending of the gag clause provisions that got prohibited. Do you see that area of kind of potential bipartisan compromise over the next couple of years?
I don't know that it'll be bipartisan completely. I think there are some areas where people will be able to work together on drug prices. The administration has put out a blueprint of what they would like to do. They are now also focusing on Part B as in boy drugs. The Obama administration had a plan for Part B drugs that they thought would slow down the costs and lower costs and spending, and that was met with a lot of people saying, "What are you doing?" So that the Trump administration retracted that when they came in, and they now put out a proposal, and a number of people look at it and say that's really complicated. In some areas, you need legislation to pass to do that, and some of it has to do with pricing related to other countries, and in the past, we haven't wanted to do that, so why do we want to do it now? There are lots of policy issues. I think that when you are 2 years out from a presidential race, it is unlikely that you get sweeping reform in programs, and it would be unlikely to get dramatic legislation controlling the price of drugs. I do, however, think that we will see some action on drug prices. I just can't predict right now what it's going to be. I don't think it will be, let's put it on a fee schedule like the VA. I think you may see more, let's find ways to negotiate better prices. I think you'll find more, well, if we give more information to people about drug prices, they can start choosing more. But actually going in and saying we're only going to pay X for this drug and put it on a fee schedule, I don't think will happen. But this is also an area that they could do on budget reconciliation and try to work through a consensus to find some ways to control the price of drugs through reconciliation. Did I answer your question?
I think that gives a sense of maybe something we keep talking about, but maybe there's not a there's not a silver bullet anytime soon. It doesn't sound like.
Right. Yeah.
You mentioned kind of a certain senator from Texas interested in physician-owned hospitals. I know that's of interest to many of our clients too, in terms of the current moratorium, but it didn't really rise to something that was at the top of the agenda the last 2 years. Now, with certain Democrats in charge in the House that are often have been skeptical of physician-owned hospitals, any sense on whether that actually has any room to be removed, the moratorium, or are we kind of let's see where we are in 2 years?
I think most members of Congress would say, well, it gave them a kind of a safety valve. They can go to CMS and demonstrate that they're trying to do something new so that they can expand. It's a very narrow definition of what can be done. If the self-referral issue moves in the House and comes to the Senate, I think that Senator Cornyn from Texas will do everything he can to try to figure out how to open up the moratorium. I don't know that there's enough consensus within the Senate to do that right now. It isn't just Democrats who have raised some issues. There are some Republicans who've been concerned about physician-owned hospitals. I'm going to make a vast generalization. To some degree, it's more of a regional issue than a national issue. And some members of Congress look at that and say, I'm not sure, I'm not sure that I really want that in my state because it doesn't fit what my state's already been doing.
Right.
So it's something that I think that the physician-owned hospitals would have to figure out how to build a consensus beyond the regional issue. But
Understood.
I also don't underestimate John Cornyn on anything.
when a member has a priority, it can often be all of ours. Why don't we're getting low on time, Stephanie, and I think we've gotten through most of the questions that came through the queue. I've tried to weave them through. Maybe we can close with this. Especially in the House, we're going to have a lot of new members on both sides of the aisle because of so many retirements. Many of these folks weren't even state legislators. They were, former intelligence officers, military, business folks, again, on both sides of the aisle. A lot more women in Congress than in the past. As folks that have been listening to us, whether they agree with either of our views or not, immaterial in this sense, they might be looking to impact the process the next couple of years. And like you said, hey, healthcare means different things to many different people. Words of wisdom in terms of educating these new members on important issues, how to approach them, to kind of kick off the 116th in an appropriate way.
That's a great question to end on. I talked to a candidate who did win a district that flipped from Republican to Democrat. She does not have a healthcare background, and her comment to me in passing was, I feel like I have a lot to learn. A lot of those members aren't going to be on health-related committees, but particularly in the House, members can go to the members on the committees of jurisdiction and say, this is really important to me to get done. I think it's important that if you have a healthcare issue, that if you have a facility or have some tangential relationship to a district with a new member in particular, but this works with any member, it is important to get to know either the staff or the member themselves and help educate them. I was a staffer for a very long time, and people would come in and be very nervous, and I would ask them why they were nervous, and they would say, because you're a healthcare staffer and you know so much. But only you know your business model. Only you know the issues you face in the healthcare system. I don't, as a staffer. So you have more information than any staffer or any member about what you do and how it affects, different proposals will affect you. It's really important to get those messages across to the staff. And district staff is fine to work with. And come to DC, meet the health staff of the members. You will find that staff is often a reflection of the member. So if they are good staffers and good members, they will follow up with you. When I worked for Ron Wyden, there was a particular doctor. I know more about neurology from this particular doctor because he came 4 times a year. Sometimes he came just to say hi. But we always made time to see him, and he eventually became a person that we would call and say, so what do you think about this particular proposal, if it were appropriate to talk to him about it. So getting to know the staff and the members and going in and telling your story of how something works or doesn't work is really important. It's the only way they learn.
Well, Stephanie, I appreciate you spending this hour with me and helping me kind of get caught back up. I'm sure the folks who joined us today did as well. On your screen, you should have both of our email addresses. If there's anything that you want to discuss further from today's conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, a wonderful 116th Congress, and we look forward to speaking with you all again soon.
Thank you, Tim.